Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. My talk today is about business for good, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about CRS work for the very poor and cut over to what business can do. Just want you to see that picture is actually in the dining room of Catholic Relief Services. We love to see healthy mothers and children because many children die before they're 5 years of age. And in fact, there's that picture, but underneath it, there's a prayer in both English and Spanish. The prayer says, Lord, please give food to those who are hungry, and for those who have food, please give them a hunger for justice. And I say that because that's very much the work of CRS. It's either helping people with their physical needs, in terms of food, and in many ways also engaging people such as Catholics in the United States with the whole idea of justice, a proper place for people in the world. On either side of our dining room, actually, one wall has pictures of nature, water, fishes, trees, plants, fruits, and so on, and it says, we shall see the bounty of the Lord. And then in the other wall, we see people eating, we see people making food and so on, and it says, in the land of the living. And so we sit in the middle between these two walls, which is the bounty of the Lord and the land of the living, which means that it's a reminder to us that our work is really to enable God's bounty, not so much our generosity, but God's generosity, to be used and shared by everybody on earth. Everybody should have access to God's bounty. So that's pretty much a sense of CRS work. And you also see in that slide at the bottom, it says faith, action, results. And that's our tagline. What we do because of faith. We are charged to bring actions and solutions. And for us, we see that it's a privilege for us to be serving the poor, that we have the resources that the American church, the American government, global governments actually allow us to have, and so we have to deliver results. So accountability is also very important to us. I'm just going to run through this to let you know that in the world, we actually work with 163 other Caritas organizations. These are the national Caritas organizations or charitable organizations, and CRS, along with Catholic Charities, represent the Caritas organization of the United States. We work with over 1,200 partners. Half of those is the Catholic Church in the countries we work in. And because of the gospel message, we serve everyone. We don't serve on the basis of people's religion. We don't serve only Catholics or Christians. We serve whenever there is a need. So of the countries that we're in, whether it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and so on, there may be very few Catholics. A little bit on sort of where we are. We are in now 101 countries. We move back and forth, all the colored areas we work in. We serve anywhere from 85 million to 105 million people every year. Our budget goes from about 650 million to 950 million. And there are 5,000 of us spread out in the world of about 100 countries. We work in 11 sectors of work, which means that we solve a lot of different problems. We actually believe that problems are multidimensional. So hunger is not just solved by food. Hunger may be solved by literacy, for example, or by the availability of sanitation. So that gives you a little bit of where we are. This chart basically shows that in the last 30 years, the global community has actually made a lot of progress in terms of solving problems. You will sometimes get the sense that all you read about is problem and more problem. Do we ever solve any of our problems? And actually, as a global community, this is not just the Catholic Church or CRS, but working together with the United Nations, with countries in different parts of the world, different NGOs, and so on. We've actually made a lot of progress. Just some sampling of that progress on the upper right, left, facing you. Water. in the last 20 years now, 2 billion people now have access to clean water. The big red one is about the transmission of HIV/AIDS, where HIV/AIDS could have been a pandemic, but there was a goal, and the United States actually was the lead, and the Catholic Church also stepped up, and that is to stop transmission between mothers and children, so that this is a one-generation epidemic rather than cross generations. And now when the drug is made available, it's called ART, the transmission rate is about 2%. Okay? Last night I talked a little bit about Ebola, the fact that Ebola was a big deal about 6 to 8 months ago, and now you hardly hear about it, and it could have become a global pandemic. Also, you see the eradication of various disease, in this case was ringworm. So I just want to have this chart to give you a sense that if we put our mind at it, we could actually do a lot of good. In the middle, in terms of children under 5, the mortality rate, we have gone from 12 million children who die a year now to 7 million. That's still a huge number, but the reduction of 5 million deaths is not something to sneeze at. So this is the ingenuity of the human race. I think that these are the miracles too, that God allows us to participate. There's a reading, I remember, where it was the man who was lowered from the top of the house through a hole into Jesus' midst. He was lame, and Jesus said, pick up your mat and walk. And the last line of that, usually where they ended, it says, the people thought, what a miracle has happened today. And I just want to say, our work, takes us into the miracles of people's lives every day. And when I read that passage, I got the sense, I said, these are God's miracles, and we have the privilege of being a part of it. The privilege of preventing a death. The privilege of preventing stunting. The privilege of helping a mother who does not have to sell a child. You can go on and on. But so those are some of the achievements. But I also want to say there's still a lot of challenges left, and I'm not going to go into it. Today, the people who live under $1.25 a day, that's about 1 billion people. 1 out of 7 live on $1.25, which is what it takes, and actually less than what it takes, to download a song into your iPod. Right? And $1.25 as extreme poverty doesn't say a lot, because even $4 a day is difficult to live on. And of course, 800 million people or so go hungry every year. When they go to bed, they just don't have enough to eat. And many of those are actually farmers. We also know poverty is highly related to violence. And when we see those two, they come together. And of course, there's still 1 billion people who don't have clean water. Only 50% of women actually have access to safe facilities for birthing. So the whole idea really is there's still a lot of problems. Trafficking is a big problem, and it's actually very difficult to get numbers for trafficking. And among trafficking, most of the time people think about young girls. Actually, there's a lot of trafficking of men into slave labor. Now there's a lot more research being done on it, so quite a number of industries, including seafood. How many of you like seafood? Yeah? The seafood industry actually has a lot of people captured inside these fishing boats, and they could never see land. Right? So the whole global problem of human trafficking, of course, that's a byproduct or complementary product of drug and arms trafficking. And so those are the distribution channels and the infrastructure for human trafficking. So I want to give you a sense of what can be done, what has been done, what remains to be done. And that's why this is where I want to bring in the role of business. Let me just use Haiti as an example in terms of how business entered into the picture. By the way, these problems are so large. There is no way that nonprofits or government alone can solve these problems, and I'll go into that a little bit. But let's just take a look at this Haiti. This is the Haiti recovery. In January, I just went there because it was the 5th year commemoration of Haiti. What you see is the cathedral, which is completely ruined. Underneath then, you see a woman with a new house. The house has green walls, and she's very excited. Just to give you some sense, it is very difficult to get a home in Haiti. And actually, before the earthquake, people were living in a lot of lean-tos built into the middle of the mountains. It's not safe, and they don't own them. A lot of times they rent them. A lot of times the land title cannot be established. So before the earthquake was pretty bad. And so now you look at a house. Let's go through a little bit. What does it take to have a house? So first of all, after the earthquake, everywhere there was ripples. Just ripples everywhere. So there's no equipment to remove the ripples. There are no roads for the equipment to remove the ripples, and there's no place to put the ripples. That's the beginning of the problem. And so to overcome that problem, in fact, CRS devised a solution. CRS bought these rubble crushers. So you imagine a drum, a big drum on a stand, and inside the drums are these blades that could grind up concrete. And outside, you activate the blades by a crank. It takes about $9,000 US to buy one of these drums. You put the concrete into it, you grind it up, and you use the concrete for rebuilding. It's about $9,000 a piece of equipment, and we trained up entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur who received training can form a crew of 7 people. And if they work around the clock, it's about 3 crews for that particular location. So that's 21 people employed. They now have a business. They have capital equipment, and they sell the ripples back to us. All right? And we use the ground up concrete as the base for these new 10,000 shelters. Right? So here is a business solution to solve that particular problem. It's also difficult to get people to come back, even though it looks nice, because they have no way to make a living. When they're in the camp, it's terrible conditions, but they don't have to worry about food. They don't have to have a job, because in the camp, they receive food and their children go to school. Once they move back into their own neighborhood, they don't have a means to make a living. So the second thing you have to attend to is small business development. How will these people make a living? Do they need a bakery? Do they need a barber? Do they need, chickens and eggs and so on? And so it's a whole development of business enterprises so that people could have livelihood, so that they would move back and they would have an income, right? So that's another way that business comes back in. The third thing, in fact, that we're now doing is that the removal of solid waste is the problem. These houses don't have bathrooms. And so, as you could imagine, there's a lot of open sewer. And that's not very attractive. And in fact, it's a problem. And sometimes they put it in the ravines, and when there is a flood, then all these things get back into people's homes. And so now we actually have signed up with a solid waste removal company where they use this solid waste and also liquid waste for recycling. So we use business, which has an incentive to collect the waste because they could reuse the waste. And then people have a solution, which is a sustainable solution to how you manage something as basic as waste. Another thing we're doing now in another neighborhood is that we found that it's very difficult to get land title in Haiti. But if you can solve that problem, if you can get from the government a piece of land, which a government can give away, you could actually develop neighborhood. And we found that, quote unquote, the middle class in Haiti would like to own their own homes, just like what you want to do, but they don't have enough funding. And so the new way that we do things now is we raise funds from philanthropists, so they can give several $1 million. Then CRS also raised funds from different government agencies, such as the USAID, so there's that money. And with those 2 layers of money, we could then go to the bank and enable these future homeowners to borrow from the bank at a below market rate. And why can they borrow at below market rate? because the first two tiers of money, the first two pools are what we call tranches of money that came from philanthropy and from grants, are able to reduce the risk for the banks, right? So this first tranche of several $1 million can be used as sort of the bottom of the equity for these homeowners, or it could be used as a loan guarantees. So that when people go and borrow from the bank, you could tell the bank the first so many tens of thousands of dollars of losses will be covered, right? With that, we will take the risk for the losses for a certain amount of money. So these are all the things that we're trying in Haiti, in order to bring the economy up again. I want to give you a sense of that hospital. It's a beautiful hospital that just came out. It was the oldest hospital that was started by a group of Catholic women over 100 years ago. It was leveled to the ground by the earthquake. And now it's built back as a two-story, two-building hospitals in the middle of Port-au-Prince. In fact, it is the very first public service building to come up in Port-au-Prince in the last 5 years. And that hospital, by the way, we use this model of build back better. It used to be a hospital for free to the poor people, but it could not sustain itself. There was not enough revenues. Now, in building back this hospital, there are two things which are different. One is we are working with the Catholic Health Association of the United States, as well as Notre of Haiti, to become a teaching hospital. Right? So now it trains Catholic medical students and also make use of Catholic healthcare in the United States. And because of that, there is a wing for rich people. And they will charge the rich people so that they have a revenue stream to support the people who cannot pay. Right? So that's also an application of a business model. On the upper left for me is farm work. CRS now has a huge body of agriculture work because around the world there are 800 million small farmers who are very poor. The problems that present is that these farmers are so poor that when they borrow money to buy seeds and so on, a lot of times their crops are so poor in quality and in quantity that even in an okay season, they barely make it in terms of getting enough proceeds and revenues from their crops to repay the loans that they borrow and a little bit for their family. If they miss the payments on these loans, some of these loans charge 12% a month. So if you have some type of disasters like rain came too soon, rain came too late, these are in the mountainous areas, but in a lot of other countries we work in, if you're near to the sea level, you could actually have a flood and salt can come into the soil. And sometimes there's pestilence. And so when farmers miss their harvest, it's a devastating consequence because they cannot repay their loans. And then the interest become principals. They have to sell their assets. So sometimes they only have land. Sometimes they have a few animals. They have to sell those. And sometimes they may have to sell their children. Right? And then when there's not enough, once you lose your farm, which is just several acres, you become laborers, day laborers. You have no place to live. You go from farm to farm in the harvest season to try to get work. That doesn't work. In a couple of years, you move into the city, you become part of the urban poor. And then your children is high risk of belonging to gangs, right? So that's how so working with farmers is very important. And the other reason that it's important is because the world will not have enough food if the land is not productive. So we anticipate population growth. We anticipate in 15 years, the demand for food will be very large, much larger than the amount of land we have available, which currently is not in production. So what that means is that whoever is farming got to be successful, right? Not just for themselves, but for feeding the world. and also because there's climate change coming. So we know that because of climate change, there will be certain problems associated with agriculture. So we work very hard now. We work with communities of farmers to change what they plant. If they had coffee and mangoes, and if those have value, we look at how they plant those. What type of seed varieties? How do they manage the erosion of their land? How do they get value from their produce, particularly post-harvest? And sometimes it's because there's no roads. Sometimes we need to build a facility that allows them to can the food or to juice the fruit. But they're looking at what we call the supply chain to look at agriculture. In Africa, we just signed onto a new project which within 7 years, we will work with 6 million farmers in what is called climate smart agriculture. And it deals a lot with livelihood, but it's no good just to be able to have healthy mangoes. You have to have a market to sell the mangoes to. And because of our agriculture work now, we work with a lot of large companies. In Central America, we work with the Central America division of Walmart because we want our farmers to be able to sell into the market. We want them to sell to Walmart. Walmart is a tough customer, so we have to make sure that the quality and the quantity is there. The other reason is that a lot of these large companies, they don't tend to buy from the small farmers because the transaction costs are too high. These farmers are very small, and large companies really don't know how to work with several million, tens of millions of very small farmers. And so what they do is they buy from the large farms and the large aggregators, because they know how to work with large entities. And so the problem becomes these small farmers all have to sell to the large aggregators. And sometimes the large aggregators are the ones who lend the money to the small farmers. So they control everything, and they control the pricing at which the farmers have to sell. And then the ones who hold the loans, and the ones which in some ways drive the farmers off their land. And so when that happens, what you will see is that small farmers, and this happens in the United States too, right? But this is how people make a living in these countries. These very small farmers, they cannot make a living. They have to sell their land, and then that whole cycle repeats. So it becomes very important for us, our job, and the irony that I'm a business school dean, is that I understand these type of economics, is we develop our capacity of working with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, and millions of farmers to change the way that they farm so that they could move into the value chain and sell to large companies. So we also work with Ben & Jerry's, for example, and our first stage of our proposal looked at 5 commodities: sugar, banana, cocoa, coffee, and sugar. Did I say that? But 5 commodities where we looked at how they purchase and also how smallholder farmers are involved in these commodities around the world. And our second stage is to redesign the value chain, which means that how can these large companies change the way that they purchase their supplies so that in a way the people at the bottom can also benefit, right? So that's the type of work that we're doing. I'll give you another example. Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, there are, livelihood is a great problem. If people don't have a way of making a living, they will grow drugs, poppies, or they will side with a terrorist group, which gives them some type of options. So helping people develop livelihood options is critical. So I was there several years ago looking at our programs that train women to start small businesses. And these women come in groups of 20, and they're trained. And then they're given a small capital pool to start their business. So the 2 groups I visited with that day, the first group was trained in making curtains and cushion covers. And in Afghanistan, people sit on the floor a lot, so cushions are very important. And so cushion covers is a way of how they express themselves, and then curtains. This group of women work very hard. During the day, they are the ones who take care of the house. They clean it, they do the cooking. They go into the mountain to collect firewood for the winter, and then the second half of their day, they start sewing and making these curtains and so on. This group was very successful. And when I asked them what they wanted as a next step, they said that they would like to start their own retail store in the village that they were operating, rather than sewing and then selling to somebody else. And they were now sending some of their members into the big city to buy patterns and come back and innovate on their design. And their daughters, for example, they want them to go to school. And the daughters now have cell phone and jeans and so on. But that was what prosperity looked like for that group of women. The second group of women I visited with, and they had a bakery. So their business was to bake these butter cookies, actually, and they were just really wonderful. Their investment was a big oven and 3 months of supplies, sugar, flour, and so on. And the women told me that they sold out their inventory in 1 week. And I asked them, how did they do that? Well, they went to Afghan police force. You know how policemen everywhere loves donuts? Well, the policemen bought their whole, there's just every day these policemen have their own standard delivery. And the women said now they needed to expand, they need more training. The very simple accounting templates that we gave them, they are now outgrowing those templates. The woman who led the group, for example, said she was breastfeeding a baby. And I said, this is your baby? She said, yes. I said, how many children do you have? I forgot the number, but then she told me the child before this one died because of malnutrition. And now this child would not die because she has a business, they have a business, and they're prosperous. So when we talk about business, whether it's small business, whether it's large business, we understand actually we can't have solutions if we don't work with business. And I think what Pope Francis actually said was that business has to work for people, not the other way around. He didn't say business is a bad thing. He said business has to work for people. And these are some examples. I'll give you one more example, and that is in Central America. And as many of you know, we have undocumented immigrants. They take huge risks to come to this country. Young people don't have many opportunities. They either don't have anything to do or they could join gangs. So in El Salvador now, we have completed the first stage of a program, which is the pilot, where we work with 5,000 at-risk youth. These are young people from age 15 to age 25. They go through a program which is called Youth Build. They go through 400 hours of training. Some of it is life skills, some of it is vocational skills. And while they're going through training, we work with over 200 businesses to provide internships. The success rate of this group is about 85%. That 85% of these young people go on to take a job or start a small business. It's also important for the businesses because they cannot get labor, right? I mean, a lot of the youth goes into the gangs, and the people they can employ, I'm not sure about whether they could really do the job or have good values. So when the young people graduate from our programs, they receive a certification, which then is important for the businesses. But if not, for the 200 businesses, we would not be able to do this work. And now we are seeking funding from 5,000 to 10,000. That's our next step, is to do a program for 10,000 youth in El Salvador. Our goal is eventually to take this to include, to be able to cover all the youth, at-risk youth of El Salvador, and that's about 100,000. And we will also take this program into Guatemala. But to give you some sense, the way that we work is not micro. I mean, every person is important, but when we think about solutions, we have to think at scale. Otherwise, we won't have a lot of impact. So those are some examples of the work that we do and how we engage business. I just want to cover a little bit before I go into video, a little bit on the church teaching about business. I'm going to focus only on 5 points. The first point is that more than 100 years ago, in the encyclical Rerum Novarum, the Pope basically said economic activity is a moral activity. It has implications for how we treat people. There's a justice issue. So economic activity basically cannot be disconnected from your faith. That economic activity is a moral activity. And as recent as Pope Benedict, if you take it forth 100 years, in his encyclical Caritas Veritate, he basically said, charity is not just interpersonal in nature, but it's also institutional, which means that our economic systems, our political systems, we also have to set our eyes on whether these systems are just or unjust. So the first thing is to remember that economic activities are moral activities. The second point is that the most important purpose of these economic activities is to enhance the dignity of the human being. And that's why Pope Francis said, businesses are not here to use people. People don't exist for business, but business exists for people. And in fact, the primary importance of business is that it needs to be able to advance the dignity of persons. And we know in many ways it does that. Business and work is a way where we could gain security, we could express our gifts. Sometimes we are developed at work, and we express our creativity, we bring out gifts. And because we are social beings, we are very interdependent on one another, and business is a way of organizing those activities where that interdependence can be addressed, right? But the second point really is all of the things that we think about business, it's most important that business exists to advance the dignity and provide the dignity of the human being. The third thing, which is very important, is that and Pope Benedict in Caritas in Veritate said, is that business itself is not evil. There is nothing to fear about business. It is the moral energies of the people who run it. Business is just a tool, right? And so the proper use or improper use, the exploitation, really rests on the people, not the institution itself. So it puts the focus on individuals, and that's why a lot of work now on the vocation of the business leader. How can you live your faith and at the same time honor the gospel teachings, right? So that's the third thing is the person. The fourth thing is a caution, and it came through particularly in Pope John Paul II's teaching Sanctissimus Annus, for example, and says, money itself, you have to be aware, it's not the evil thing, but you have to be aware how you acquire your money, how you spend your money and share your money, and how you identify with your money, okay? Do you define your worth by your money? But it says basically how you acquire it, how you share it, and how you hold on to it and identify yourself with money. It's a critical thing, right? So that's the fourth thing he talks about, and I'm going to find my fifth thing. Yeah. And this is very much the point of Pope Francis, and that is about free markets. You know, he said Westerners are sort of obsessed with this idea of free markets, and whatever is the result of free markets, that's good enough. So he said free markets is not the priority. People are the priority. So on that point, actually, there's nothing which is called free markets. I mean, markets are not free. Businesses working within those markets, they have to pay tax. There are regulations on them and so on. But his point is basically just because you can find a successful business model, right, that doesn't mean that, therefore, if it could run and so on and so forth, you could make use of it if it is exploitative. Yesterday, I shared a story with the high school students of this particular point, and that is about flowers and how they're grown around the world. So I love arranging flowers. And flowers have become cheaper and cheaper. And so you could actually buy 20 big roses for $15. And you could make beautiful arrangements based on that. And I love that. Until I went to Ethiopia and I went to the flower greenhouses. And it's just huge. It goes from just miles and miles of these greenhouses. And they are invested by European companies. But those greenhouses, you know, they have plastic covers and so on. People who work in there have a higher rate of cancer. And they have a higher rate of cancer because there are a lot of chemicals which are used in fertilizers and pesticides. And the ventilation is not good, and then there's steam that comes in from the sun and the hot weather and so on. So in that case, the people who work there have a higher rate of cancer. And also at the same time, it completely draws down the water table for the surrounding farmers. So for the farmers whose ancestral land was there, they no longer have water, right? And that was the result of these flower farms. Now, next door to it was Kenya, which is a richer country than Ethiopia, and Kenya has much stricter regulations. It regulates what that work environment is supposed to be like, how many parts per million of this type of chemical or those type of chemicals can be allowed. What type of breaks do people need? How often should they have breaks? And how the water would be treated and recycled so that you don't just draw down the water table. In another word, flowers from Kenya probably cost more than flowers from Ethiopia. All right? And here's the whole idea. None of them is unregulated. There's some degree of regulation. Some country is more desperate for business investments and they have lower regulations. Some countries, they're more far along, they're more sophisticated, and they're able to have higher regulations. We see that in mining in Peru, for example, where a lot of the mining companies, they put in chemicals that create a higher level of asbestos in the water and in the soil, and the children have brain damage, right? So here is the interplay between business and community. It doesn't have to be all bad. I mean, there are ways to deal with these issues, but the people in the community have to have some say. They have to have power. They have to have leverage in order to have these conversations. So here is that whole interplay between business and communities. And I have another few minutes, and I wanted to show you a video, and this is on this whole new idea of what is called impact investing. And impact investing is this whole idea now that it used to be not-for-profit will solve social problems. Companies, on the other hand, do whatever they do, but they may abide by corporate social responsibilities. And so they at least try to be good citizens, but they would rather sell you tobacco or whatever it is. Whereas not-for-profit try to do something good. In the middle now has come a group of people called social enterprises. They're like the Paul Newman, and he would have a salad dressing that he would use the proceeds to help poor people. Or you have Tom's Shoes, where he would sell for every pair of shoes he sells to you, he gives us proceeds of one of those pairs. So it's a hybrid. What is happening now in this whole thing called impact capital is the example that I gave about Haiti. And that is when using philanthropist money, sometimes foundations like the Gates Foundations, and then there could be grant money from the government and so on. And then we go out there to get private capital, where investors actually want a financial return, but these projects now become attractive because the risk associated with them are being borne by philanthropists. You know, so like these Haitian homeowners, they're probably not the lowest risk borrowers, but the risks now are really absorbed by some of these philanthropic funds. And so it's a mix of all of these type of capital together where you could actually generate a financial return for people who provide the private capital, and you use the philanthropy capital to basically leverage a lot more money to come in. Another example is an NGO that does a lot of low cost housing. And it went to a big foundation and say, we would like to have $30 million from you so that we could buy land around the world so that we could put up low-cost housing. The foundation said, we're not going to give you $30 million to do that, but what we're going to do is we're going to put up $30 million as a loan guarantee for you to go into the market to borrow money, and in this case, below market rate, right? Because this NGO is very, very experienced for 40, 50 years building low-cost housing, so it has a track record, it knows what to do. And when now it goes into the bank could evaluate its records, but also the risk, that the bank has to take is close to zero, because it's backed up by this foundation that says we will put up the loan guarantees. And for the foundation, it's a good deal, because unless the NGO loses its money, it doesn't really have to spend that $30 million. Right? And even if the NGO loses money, it's not all 30 million of it. And so by that same sum of money, it doesn't really have to use it, and it could actually support a lot of loans where it provides the loan guarantees. That's the whole thing about impact investing. But it's a whole idea that we cannot think about is business good or is business bad? Is business a necessary evil? Overall idea really is business is a necessary good, and it's up to us to allow that potential to come through. And this whole thing called impact investing is really kind of like incremental mindset changes about how we use money. We actually last year, 2014 in June, hosted a conference in the Vatican where Pope Francis did come and address this whole issue of impact capital. So I'm going to end, and that is for you to all remember business is a necessary good. It's not business itself that is the issue, but it's the people behind the business. Thank you very much.